From Washington, the McLaughlin Group, the American original. For over 3 decades, the sharpest minds, best sources, hardest talk.
Issue 1, to spend or not to spend.
Madam President, I'm pleased to announce that our bipartisan bicameral negotiations on defense spending and other priorities have yielded a significant agreement.
Congress agreed this week to raise the debt limit until 2019 and increase military and domestic spending. Supported by President Trump, the deal will increase government outlays by around $300 billion over the next 2 years. To attract bipartisan support, the agreement includes disaster relief funding, community health grants, and allocations to fill what Defense Secretary Jim Mattis says are gaps in military readiness. Still, not everyone is happy. Republican fiscal conservatives say the agreement will blow up the deficit, and Democrats led by House Minority Leader Nancy Pelosi lament the deal's absence of a long-term solution to the Deferred Action for Childhood Arrivals, or DACA, program.
All right, before I jump to the first question, I want to welcome in John Schindler from the New York Observer, who's our guest this week. And I also want to give you, sir, some credit for your wonderful prediction last week in terms of the economic malady that we suffered for a few days earlier this week. So you did.
Yes, only we celebrate disasters. But
all right. Anyway, Pat, what do you think of this deal? What do you think about the deficit ramifications? Are you concerned about my generation being buried by your generation in debt?
What this shows, this deal, is that the Democratic and Republican parties can work together when they're spending other people's money, and there is no conservative party in America today or on Capitol Hill. As for the economy, we now have an economy which is at full employment, 3% growth, fairly tight labor market, and we're going to run trillion-dollar deficits all the way to the horizon. However, I guess it's good news that Clarence was right. We saw $5 trillion wiped off the stock market last week, and a significant segment of that was mine, Clarence.
it's coming back, though, Pat. It's going to come back. Patience.
The stock market is reacting basically to the blowing up of the budget and the concern that rising interest rates will follow. And the tax cut, well, maybe Republicans can celebrate it, but there's a cost to that. And the cost is going to be in rising mortgage rates, interest rates. And so I think the spending they agreed on this week, I applaud all of it. It was necessary spending, but they blew the cap with the tax cut, and that's the part that we shouldn't have. And the president's not going to get any credit because his White House is in an absolute meltdown with 2 officials leaving because of domestic abuse allegations. Right. The chief of staff submitting his resignation if the president wants it.
Do you think John Kelly should have been fired over the Rob Porter?
I think John Kelly's future is in Donald Trump's hands, just like everybody else in that White House. And if not John Kelly, who? Who wants to join that House of Horrors?
Would you have fired him? Were you president?
Would I have fired? I wouldn't have had John Kelly there in the first place.
All right, Clarence, what are your thoughts on this? And I need you to defend the millennial thing where we need entitlement reform. I can't speak anymore.
No.
You know something? I will say that Pat and I are in agreement on the basic hypocrisy of saying deficits matter if the other party wants to do it, but if our party wants to do it, then it's okay. I mean, this is what's happened here with the Republicans, and we have a situation in which the deficits, I mean, do they mean something or don't they? Right. It's getting rather ridiculous to be as double-sided about it.
There is a profound hypocrisy, isn't there, from Republicans who lamented President Obama and now are very happy to absorb.
For that matter, Bill Clinton, who was actually the last president to balance the budget, and somehow it doesn't matter now when the Republicans are in charge.
John, you know, do you think here, to borrow the Tea Party analogy, because how can I resist, in Boston, that the Republicans have simply throwing money overboard now?
I mean, look, I'm old enough to remember when the GOP stood for fiscal responsibility, taming deficits, support for the FBI and law enforcement. All Americans above the age of 3 also remember when the GOP stood for those things. So this is in some ways more the Trumpization of the GOP, who Trump has never cared much about fiscal orthodoxy in the party. And here we are.
Tom, this is basically unsustainable. You've got, again, trillion-dollar deficits as far as all the way to the horizon. We're fighting something like 5 or 6 wars abroad. You're building up the military. There is going to be no entitlement reform in an election year.
What
No
about
matter what
after
you-
the election?
Medicaid, Medicare,
What
Social.
about after the election?
Trump is not for it. The Democrats aren't for it. The Republicans are commit suicide for it.
And millennials, but our future has been stolen.
The leadership on the Hill, notably Paul Ryan, has been after entitlement reform for most of his career. So they'll try to come after the major programs. But Democrats are not going to allow that to happen. You need 60 votes. Democrats won't let that happen because to pay for the tax cut, they didn't pay for the tax cut. You're not going to pay for it on the backs of people's Medicare and Medicaid. And you can't get any infrastructure either. The President in the State of the Union called for 1.5 trillion?
Yeah.
No, not
One
trillion.
for- yeah,
No, wait,
1.5
yes.
Was it
trillion.
was it trillion?
It's-
All right, it was a lot of money for infrastructure, and we need it, and money is cheap right now, but it won't be cheap for very long because interest
But
rates
you
are
can't
about
do
to
all of
go
these
through the roof.
things
Right.
for very, very long. I mean, it is not sustainable.
Right. I think your Social Security can be salvaged by, first of all, raising the caps on the, now
that's a
the-
tax
the
increase.
cap. It is a
Well,
tax
but what
increase.
about if you were to do that and then
But-
you were also to reform it so that people of my age, well, people slightly older, maybe people of John's age, then don't get the same measure of benefits that perhaps existing recipients get. We have to do, the math is
that's
clear.
A possibility.
The math is clear.
That's a possibility. You won't get that through in an election year, but
Yeah. All right.
that's just basic politics.
We have-
All right, good. We've formed an alliance. We need to go on to issue 2, though.
Maybe when Vice President Pence is in the Oval
Okay,
Office.
well, we'll see what happens to that. Issue 2, Trump's parade.
Attending France's Bastille Day parade last July, President Trump was wowed by President Macron's pageant of military might. But now President Trump intends to build on his Parisian experience. On Tuesday, the Washington Post reported that the commander-in-chief has ordered the Pentagon to begin planning a military parade in Washington, D.C. What form might the parade take? Well, that's not known. But what is known is that Democrats and some Republicans believe President Trump's order is an expensive mistake. They suspect this is perhaps more about Mr. Trump's ego than it is celebrating the U.S. military's power.
Pat, I'm going to go with a little pop quiz here. What is a triumph originally? What is the... describe the Roman triumph.
I'll tell you what's closest to it. I was at the parade in 1991 after Desert Storm when the Schwarzkopf headed them up. I was right next to, in the area next to George H.W. Bush. It was tremendously moving. You started with the F-17 stealth flying overhead. You had the 82nd, 101st Airborne, and the Schwarzkopf came up. In the old days, though, Tom, you had behind the chariot, you had a collar around the defeated general. But that's what I felt it was like. But today you can't do it because we're not a united country. We don't have a big victory behind us. The commander-in-chief is not disliked by half, or is disliked by half the country. So I just don't think it is the time or place for a military parade.
Is
Not
Trump
like
Julius Caesar?
1991.
Is he a wannabe Caesar?
He's a wannabe king. But after 17 years of war and no really clear victories, this is not time to celebrate. I think we should honor the 1% of the country in the volunteer services, and maybe there's an appropriate way to do that on Veterans Day. But the kind of parade that the president is envisioning with, I think, tanks and planes on Pennsylvania Avenue, that is fascistic. It is scary.
Oh,
that's the
not
kind
fascistic,
of
but
thing. Well, I think
Look,
it
I
is.
saw
It's what
Eisenhower's
North Korea does. It's
inaugural.
what
They had all that stuff
Mussolini
coming
did.
through.
It's what Hitler did.
One thing about what's interesting here is we think of it as fascistic because we've been seeing all this footage of North Korean parades like this.
Right.
But what made that Desert Storm parade so great, Pat, you'll recall, and being a Vietnam-era draftee, I remember well, that we never had a parade. Those of us who came back from the Vietnam War.
Korea didn't either.
And so, right, you know, and that was one big thing that made that parade so great for folks at the time. It was like a delayed celebration. We went overboard thinking, hey, we really are mighty and all enough to go into Iraq now or whatever, you know.
And you served.
That's what we got to watch out. I did serve. I wasn't in a combat zone at the time, but I was part of the call-up.
We didn't have bone
That
spurs.
affected our entire, thank you. Yeah, I was, I think, bone spurs. I hadn't heard about that before.
Yeah,
But
Yeah, the notion of the president who's had 5 deferments sitting there and sort of glorifying in the fact that he is the commander of all of this hardware, I mean, it's sickening. And
But it's not fascistic
bad
like
enough,
France
it's
does
bad
it, though.
enough to watch members of the cabinet around a table, you know, celebrate him as dear leader. I mean, this is about Trump's ego. This is not about anything else.
John, what do you think, John?
I mean, having served in the Navy, look, I think Pat's right that the last time we did this was 1991, when there was a victory to celebrate, and there really was messaging to the Vietnam era in that too.
Right.
But we don't really have much tradition in this country of a Bastille Day parade. We don't have to cite North Korea, but a Bastille Day roll out the tanks parade without a victory. That's really not part of our tradition. And I got to tell you, the military thinks this is all pretty risible too.
But you know, in the inaugural parades, I remember Ike's parade in the early inaugural parades in the early Cold War. So I recall they had a lot of military stuff coming through there. Of course, you get West Point and Annapolis.
John, would you would
That's
not
the
have
difference,
enjoyed
we're celebrating
walking down,
victory,
driving a
yeah.
tank down the parade route?
Let me have 2 data points here. One of which is if we run a battalion of 70-ton tanks down Pennsylvania Avenue.
That's it for
it's
Pennsylvania
No, it really
A lot
is.
of
It's going to destroy
potholes.
it.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah,
is
a lot
why
of
Trump's
potholes.
idea to do this for his inauguration, the military said, no way. I would say, because I think we lack a connection between the 1%, less than 1% that serves, and society, I'd rather take that money, take it for a parade, and have a bunch of smaller parades all around the country, in cities all around the country with local military units. Come and see
But
your
they do
military.
that. We do that now on
Yeah.
various
On
Veterans Day and others
That's right.
Day, the old Armistice Day.
I don't think
my
we need a
colleague-
parade for Trump.
My colleague Steve Chapman suggested that he would go for a parade if we'll pull out of Afghanistan first.
That's what Rand Paul said. Bring the Afghan troops home.
There
and
you go.
Have
Yeah.
a
Hold your
parade
breath.
for them.
Right, don't hold your
Right,
breath,
right.
but that's my attitude too, though. If we would do something like
Yeah.
pull
Fair
out of
enough.
Afghanistan, declare victory, and come home or whatever.
But I have found it quite striking, though, that there has been this narrative that it's fascistic. But if you look at Trooping the Colour in Britain, Bastille Day in France, there are a lot of democracies who do.
Yeah,
The issue isn't democracy,
But they
it's
have
what
a
are your
tradition of
traditions?
that. We
Exactly.
don't. This would come out of the blue, and
Yeah.
given the president that we have, it would look like a celebration of the military hardware he has at his command.
Well,
I think it's a wrong message.
I'm not going to use the word fascistic, but what I will say is that there is messaging here with this parade. And who is he messaging? We don't need to impress the North Koreans.
Yeah.
That's clear. Who is the message
China?
being sent to the American public?
Do you think it would impress
I
China?
think, well, let me
It's
defend
the
the
Trump
They know
president.
our power.
Tom,
They
let
know
me
our
defend the
Trump.
president. I think he was uplifted by what he saw on Bastille.
I agree,
It was a great event. I mean, you see them all in those old-style uniforms on horses and things. It's very uplifting and unifying for a country, and Macron is trying to do that. And I think maybe there was a good motive behind this,
Well,
Eleanor,
and what I'm
not
thinking-
a reversion to fascism.
And what I'm thinking is he's looking at Macron and thinking this little twerp gets to have this big parade, and I don't have one. I want one. See, that's how I read his
He also
motives.
got Blue Lobster on that, which is
I
very
will.
exciting. Anyway, well, when
I
we
will
come
comment.
back, sorry, what were you going to say?
I was going to compliment the president on his fine salute as the French troops went by.
Okay,
Not
well, that was
everybody
a
gets
good salute. All right, when we come back, Russian hackers, American bombs, and Bibi's bad week.
Let's just say it. There's no such thing as cancer. There's only your cancer and the precision treatment we derive from your genes.
Let's embrace the wisdom of your cancer's DNA when we learn a throat tumor is best treated by a breast cancer drug.
Let's give you a seat at the table of experts in your cancer. And as a team,
Develop a treatment plan with and just for you.
Innova. Join the future of health.
Issue 3, hacking the rolls.
Speaking to NBC News this week, the Department of Homeland Security's head of cybersecurity delivered a bombshell. As part of its efforts to interfere with the 2016 election, Jeanette Manfra said, Russia targeted the voter registration rolls of 21 states and accessed, quote-unquote, a small number of them. That has alarmed analysts who say states have yet to safeguard their voter systems in the run-up to November's midterm elections. Yet this wasn't the only Russia-related story of consequence this week. Illustrating growing tensions in Syria, on Wednesday, the US military employed artillery and airstrikes to push back Russian-allied Syrian regime forces who breached a so-called deconfliction zone. As many as 100 regime personnel were killed in those strikes, and according to one US official who spoke to CBS News, the casualties included Russian mercenaries. Note that Russia often classifies its intelligence operatives as mercenaries so as to conceal Kremlin culpability.
John, are the midterms at risk? And secondly, do you think that there is an increasing concern of what I predicted on our first show, I think, that Russia might attack American forces in Syria?
First, yes, there is serious risk to the midterms here, and I think the DHS comment is very important because last year the intelligence community's assessment, unclassified to the public, was they had at that point no evidence of Russian hacking of anything to do with actual election procedures. Clearly that line has changed, and they know a lot more. So if we don't become proactive, the midterms are definitely at risk, as is every election after.
I think we're having a little outbreak of Russophobia here on the panel, Tom. Look, in Syria, we slaughtered 100 pro-Syrian forces. That's exactly right. The problem
we should have
here
let
is
them attack the US troops.
they didn't. No one was killed in the alleged attack. But look, the United States is about ready to get into it with the Turks in Manbij. It is also up against the Syrians and Russians on the other side of the Euphrates. We've got the Kurds. We've got 1/4 of Syria. The United States better decide with 2,000 troops exactly whom we can defeat there, what we are fighting for, and who authorized us to go to war in Syria.
Well, one, the Russians are not about to let up on the most successful semi-covert operation that they've had. They're going to keep hacking, and yes, the midterms are at risk. They can go into those machines, and it's not exactly what they're going to do. The fact that they're in there at all is the problem. Right. And secondly, the authorization to wage war goes back to 2002 under George W. Bush. It did not cover Syria. So there is a real discussion on Capitol Hill as to whether the U.S. is authorized to have airstrikes. And it's not only Democrats who are talking about this, it's Republicans as well, especially with this president.
Do you think we will see a bipartisan compromise on that, Eleanor?
You know, they're so weaselly when it comes down to actually doing something that I think they will come up with something, and they will, whether it will get a vote and it will pass, I don't know.
And it's interesting how that parents used to be just sort of the Rand Paul element of the Republican bloc, but as Eleanor says, it's now becoming, you know, people like, hey, it's been a while since 2001.
Well, yeah, indeed. Well, on Syria, I would say, first of all, now President Trump has been claiming credit for success in fighting ISIS, which Barack Obama really started, and Trump has not really deviated that much from Obama's approach. Now is the time for him to take charge insofar as where's our policy going to go from here. It's not easy.
Who are we fighting in Syria and why? If ISIS is defeated, I mean, look, let's face it, Assad won the war with the help of the Russians, Iranians, and allies from Pakistan. Who are we going to go to war with, and what are we going to fight for?
As someone who has dealt with the Russians, you know.
Great deal. I don't disagree with you that our strategic aims in Syria are muddled, have always been muddled from the beginning of our involvement there. I totally agree with you on that. The problem is we are facing a leadership in the Kremlin that is enjoying provocations against the United States. Just last week, we had a U.S. spy plane in the Black Sea in international airspace. A Russian fighter came within 5 feet of it. Right. And all you need is a 1/10 of a second mistake on either side, and a bunch of people are dead. They are doing similar things in Syria, whether we should be there or not. This is the reality. If
you were president, what would you be doing differently with the Russians now?
I would take a much harder line and make clear the provocations will not be tolerated.
What are you going to do, start shooting down Russian planes in the Black Sea?
No, but we have plenty of ways. You take a harder line. The Russians understand messaging, actions with submarines, actions with aircraft in the Baltic.
What do you want to do in Syria? You want to overthrow Assad? We're going to take that over? Defeat all those forces? Are you kidding?
No. ISIS is largely defeated anyway. I think U.S. policy understands that Assad isn't going anywhere. We may say we want regime change, but we don't actually. I would simply make sure the Kurds don't get slaughtered and that we don't have anything approaching genocide in the aftermath of the war.
What are you going to do with the Turks?
The Turks are going to do what they want to do no matter what we do.
Those are nose to nose with us.
Yes.
Okay, all right, we're going to go on to the final issue. Issue 4, Bibi's Bad Week.
As you finish your first year in office, I want to say that I look forward to continuing our remarkable, tremendous friendship in the years ahead.
Speaking with President Trump just 2 weeks ago, Prime Minister Benjamin "Bibi" Netanyahu of Israel was in high spirits. This week, not so much. After all, this week the Prime Minister was rocked by Israeli media reports that police chiefs are likely to recommend charges against him in relation to ongoing corruption investigations. That recommendation could come as early as next week. The allegations against the Prime Minister include claims he gave political favours in return for expensive gifts, and that he worked with a newspaper magnate to restrict a competing newspaper. And note this, the head of Israeli police forces says his anti-corruption investigators and their families have been harassed by private detectives.
John, what impact would this have on US-Israeli relations if Prime Minister Netanyahu was to...
Well, certainly at the institutional level, not much, but the president has invested very publicly, very strongly in his relationship with Netanyahu. And, of course, in Israel, the fact that Bibi has slightly shady connections is the world's worst secret. Everyone knows this. And it was eventually going to come... The chickens here were going to come home to roost. I do think it's a big problem for the president because a lot of this is his personal relationship with Bibi and...
The Attorney General has got to approve this for it to really go to bounce Bibi.
Right.
But I'll tell you, Bibi is very Americanized. He has enormous following in the United States, especially in the Republican Party. I mean, he got 29 standing ovations from the Republican Congress. But I will say this, if you lose him and you got people like Naftali Bennett and Lieberman and these other guys, these are hardcore guys who will not have the kind of cachet and acceptance with the Americans that Bibi does. Bibi's a strategic asset, I think, for Israel.
Well, Netanyahu is an obstacle to peace, so he hasn't, I don't think he's done his country really any good. But these charges have been simmering for 2 years. It's about more than him. It's about his wife's extravagant taste. It's about a playboy son living off the Israeli taxpayers. And I'm sure that this bonds the President Trump with the Prime Minister, I guess, of Israel, because they both feel like they're being unfairly maligned. So I don't see this changes the U.S. situation at all, and there's no opportunity really out there for peace, despite Jared Kushner's best attempts.
And it was interesting, Clarence, that Prime Minister Netanyahu very much borrowed in terms of his repudiation of some of these reports from President Trump in terms of the language of bias against him, he says.
They both know how to play the victim card very well here, but the bottom line is, are we any closer to a settlement of the great grand debate around Israel?
The two-state resolution, two-state solution is almost dead. Right. Bibi Netanyahu and certainly his followers are not going to upend hundreds of thousands of settlers from the West Bank and bring them back to Israel when Bibi didn't even want to remove 8,000 people from Gaza,
President Trump
which he
this
didn't
week
plan.
did say, though, that there would have to be concessions from Israel, so he did bring that up.
Come on.
Talk is very cheap.
Okay. Well, let's ask, and yesterday, on Saturday morning, there was an incident with a Israeli Air Force jet that went down in Syria. Is that another example of what we were talking about in the
Israelis would like to get into Syria along with the United States, and it's not in our interest to do so.
And the opportunity for miscalculation and triggering conflict that we don't want is there. For this country, for Syria, for Israel, for the Russians, everybody involved.
Do you see any parallels here, John? You've written some books on the First World War between the graveyard of empires and the...
Well, I think, I mean, as in 1914, you have to be careful. Is your client state doing what you want them to do, or are they going to drag you into things that meet their interests and not yours? I mean, this is the perennial debate. And Israel, by the way, doesn't like the outcome in Syria because they've been open about it. They're much more concerned about Assad and the Iranians than ISIS.
They're concerned about the Iranians.
Israel needs U.S. backing.
Absolutely.
And the president could exact concessions if he had any idea what he wanted, if he had any strategic plan in place.
But you know, the Israelis have a red line. With the Iranians in Syria, the Iranians got to stay away from the Golan Heights. I think it's a 25-mile border that they got to stay away from. And the Israelis will hit them. They've made 100 strikes or something in there since the whole Syrian conflict began.
But how much we've talked a lot. We talked about the peace process here. We talked about the Netanyahu relationship with President Trump. How much, though, responsibility ultimately has to also be put at the foot of the Palestinians in terms of failure of political reform, mismanagement by Hamas in Gaza, and to some degree, if you look at the dimensions on the ground, not functional concessions, or am I being too?
They're functioning with Netanyahu's knee on their chest. I mean, they're so put down in that area that
they're not going to get anything from Netanyahu or Trump.
Right, exactly.
I think the larger issue, if I can redirect here, is the fact that does this White House have the ability, in extremis, to tell the Israeli government, don't do X? On 2 occasions, George W. Bush stopped the Israelis from a unilateral strike on Iran. George W. Bush, whatever his many flaws, had that cachet. Obama did not, and I really doubt the current president has either.
We have to get out. We will be right back with predictions. We'll be back with predictions.
Let's just say it. There's no such thing as cancer. There's only your cancer and the precision treatment we derive from your genes.
Let's embrace the wisdom of your cancer's DNA when we learn a throat tumor is best treated by a breast cancer drug.
Let's give you a seat at the table of experts in your cancer. And as a team,
Develop a treatment plan with and just for you.
Innova. Join the future of health.
Predictions back.
The Never Trump media have General John Kelly in their gun sights, and they'll be after him all week.
Is he going to survive?
I think he's going to survive, and on Eleanor, I believe he should survive.
Okay. Trump's military parade won't happen, but there's a cherry red Tesla orbiting in outer space, and that signals a coming public-private partnership to explore space once we get leadership in Washington that favors science.
John.
New York Times report this weekend has revisited the issue of what Moscow may have in terms of compromising materials on our president. This is the beginning of the next wave, and there is something real. There's a lot of fake, but there's something real. This is not going away.
Interesting.
Oh, that's so tantalizing.
Right. Are you going to tell us at some point?
Yes, indeed. Well, James Carroll's going to be our new drug czar, looks like, subject to approval by Congress. I foresee a conflict coming with the current opiate czar, unofficially, Kellyanne Conway, who has been in charge of this program up until now. Let's see what happens.
Okay. All right. I predict that the United States will win 10 gold medals at the Pyeongchang Games, at least 10. And here's a random fact. 28 years ago today, Nelson Mandela was released after 27 years in prison. 4 years later, Mandela would become South Africa's first post-apartheid president. Thank you for watching us. We hope you'll join us next week. But until then, make sure to follow us on Twitter at McLaughlin Group and visit our website, mclaughlin.com. Au revoir.